I'm Jeremy Goldkorn, Editor-in-Chief of the China Project. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm coming to you from a beautiful sunny winter day in Nashville, Tennessee, and I am joined by my colleague Nadia Ye, who's coming from a day of unknown weather in London, England.
Yes, we've had a bit of a cold snap this last week, but it's been manageable.
Good.
I am a senior editor at the China Project, and so thank you everyone for joining this webinar.
It has been quite the eventful year for people all over the world, and especially for all of us who follow China closely. What were the big stories in 2022, and what's in the cards for next year, which is the year of the water rabbit? As I said, I'm Jeremy Goldkorn, Editor-in-Chief of the China Project, joined by my colleague Nadia Ye. Today, we will be giving a preview of our red paper, which is our annual guide to the big issues and stories about China that we all need to know about. The red paper will be coming out next week, and we will include a link to it in the daily newsletter, and we will also email you a link to a video of this webinar, which will include a link to the red paper. And today, we're going to cover some of the highlights of the biggest stories in our red paper, and talk about some of our ideas about next year and what will happen. At any time, please leave questions in the Q&A, and we will get to them as soon as we can. The second half of our session also today is our predictions, which is something we've been doing for several years in our red paper. We're actually still finalizing our predictions, so we'd love to have your suggestions. And if we use any of them in the red paper, we will credit you by name, if you like, and give you a year's free subscription to the China Project access, either for yourself or to give away as a gift. So put the questions in the Q&A, or if you prefer to remain anonymous, email them to me, jeremy@thechinaproject.com, or you can also use the Zoom messaging function and directly message me or Nadia if you'd like. We are happy to discuss any ideas for predictions, no matter how crazy they might seem. But now let's start with the top stories of the year. Nadia has been writing the main story of our daily newsletter for most of this year, and she's got a really good sense of what news has stood out as important. But I don't think it takes you, Nadia, to decide that COVID-19, COVID-0, and the economic, social, and political side effects really are the biggest story of the year.
Oh, absolutely. This year was a roller coaster of speculation over China's COVID-0 policy. Rumors of an ease in COVID measures had sprouted up at the beginning of the year, in part fueled by the closed-loop trials at the Beijing Olympics, but then ended abruptly with the chaotic month-long lockdown of Shanghai. There were many reports of overwhelmed centralized quarantine facilities. Online food delivery services were stretched paper thin, and many residents were stuck inside their homes without enough to eat. And, not to mention the psychological toll was immense. Meanwhile,
I think, if I may interrupt, it's probably worth pointing out that this was a sort of crossed class and ethnic barriers. My Ferrari driving friends in Shanghai and migrant workers in Zhengzhou were all feeling equally beleaguered by the end of the year.
Oh, absolutely. And, meanwhile, China's economy was, basically kneecapped again and again by things shutting down at a moment's notice and snarling up global supply chains. We saw some of China's worst economic performance in decades, and investor confidence really went through its ups and downs over the slightest signal that Beijing would scale back its COVID-0 policy. China also launched a stimulus package at the end of May, but there have been dozens of local and central government measures to encourage consumption and rev up the economy. But, people still seem pretty pessimistic. And, now, after the deadly apartment fire in the capital of Xinjiang that killed 10 people and ignited rare protests in Shanghai, Beijing, other major cities in China, and then spread all across the world, China is finally dropping a lot of measures that kept the country in isolation for the past 3 years. Though, now an incoming wave of COVID infections is again threatening to overwhelm the country's healthcare system and put its most vulnerable populations like its under-vaccinated elderly at risk. Well, speaking of risk, US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi took a huge one this August when she made a surprise stop in Taiwan during her tour in Asia. I mean, things were already tense in Taiwan, but they skyrocketed to new heights. Jeremy, how do you see the situation in the Taiwan Strait now?
This is the question that I think I've been asked most frequently this year, at least in connection to China, is China going to invade Taiwan? And I've got this question professionally, from other journalists, from scholars, and from the parents who I meet when I pick up my kids from school. So this has become an issue that has penetrated into even the sort of people who don't really care at all about China all over the world, and perhaps particularly in the United States. Global tensions over Taiwan were already brewing before the Pelosi visit, given the spat Beijing had with Vilnius, the capital, the Lithuania, over a Taiwan representative office being opened in the capital. There have been other foreign delegations paying visits to Taipei from several European countries and other countries around the world. And the Biden administration has put in several new policies that are in some ways friendlier to Taiwan and more hostile to Beijing. And Joe Biden himself has made several statements about coming to Taiwan's defense, which although he's sort of, or his people have walked them back a little bit, the message has been pretty clear. At least it's perceived as being pretty clear, I think, in Beijing. And Pelosi's visit did unleash a chain of reaction. It was in some ways a poke at Beijing's most sensitive foreign policy wound. And it provoked what many have started calling the fourth Taiwan Strait crisis, in which China responded with live fire military drills, the suspension of talks with US officials, certain kinds of sanctions, the first white paper about Taiwan that has issued under Xi Jinping's leadership. What we found in some of the stories we published and Q&As we did was Taiwan's citizens seemed, eerily calm in the face of the military drills. But the island is shoring up its defenses with the help of $425 million worth of spare aircraft parts and weapon systems, courtesy of the Biden administration. And then there's the question that everybody's been asking: will China decide to invade Taiwan? And at this point, I'll preempt a little bit our prediction section. I would say no, at least not in 2023. But it could still be a very tense year in what The Economist once called the world's most dangerous place, above the objections of many people in Taiwan, I would say. I think we have a couple of questions. So before we go on to our next topic we want to highlight, let's address these because they're about COVID-0. Philip asks, now that COVID-0 appears to be relaxing, I've seen forecasts of a huge surge in infections in China. Do you feel that Beijing has a realistic or actionable view of how to mobilize if this comes to pass? What would you say, Nadia?
1 second, let me pull it up. Let's see. How to mobilize.
I will give you a time to think and respond with, the Communist Party is extraordinarily good at reacting to suddenly emerging situations, particularly when there are large numbers of people's lives are at stake. If you think of responses to, say, the Sichuan earthquake, or indeed after the initial bungling of the pandemic right at the beginning of 2020 in Wuhan, the swiftness of action, which, until this year was in fact praised around the world. And they did indeed save a lot of lives, whether one thinks the lockdown and the contact tracing policies were good or not. So, I mean, my impression is if there does start to be a real crisis where it looks like large numbers of people are going to get severely ill and die, that the government is going to mobilize everything it can to respond. Maybe you can take the second question we have on COVID, Nadia. Is
Sure.
one thing, I don't know if you can see it, Abraham or Nick asks, one thing that has been mystifying to him, why was the government unable or unwilling to compel better vaccination compliance among the elderly? The recognition that this was or is a major health and political risk that was preventing relaxation of COVID policies seems well recognized. What would you say?
So I would say a lot of it also came from resistance from the populations themselves. And, you've got to remember that China also, there were very few cases amongst the general population. So it also, once a few vaccinations had occurred, there was also not so much incentive to get boosters because very few people actually knew people who were infected with COVID. And, speaking as someone who was in Hong Kong and who's born and raised in Hong Kong and has, people back there who I know back there. There's also a certain level of distrust too about vaccinations and a lot of misinformation that went through WeChat or WhatsApp. And, people were just very hesitant, I think.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, to put some flesh on the hesitancy about vaccines, I mean, China has a pretty bad, Chinese pharmaceutical companies, vaccine makers, have a pretty bad record of selling dodgy vaccines. And so there's been for many years a fear of vaccines, and particularly a fear of domestically produced vaccines. I think the other factor is that I think the government and the party got a little too confident. I think hubris is responsible for some of the reason why they didn't pursue a more aggressive vaccination campaign. They did seem to have the disease under control, and there seemed to be this idea that as long as they could last long enough in Fortress China without any mortalities, eventually the pandemic would play itself out, and they could open up gradually without having to compel people to be vaccinated. But at some level, that's just guesswork. So we have another couple of questions, but let's go on with our own summary of the year's events, and we'll get to those questions when we're done with this bit. And please do continue adding questions or predictions if you like. So let's talk about property. Nadia, could you give us a kind of top level summary of the real estate situation in China?
Yeah, so the property sector really struggled, to be frank, compared to the last decade. Between 2010 and 2020, home prices doubled and developer profits quadrupled in China. But starting from the summer of 2021, real estate prices began to slide, and China's property developers began to struggle to repay their loans. By August of this year, the value of home sales were down nearly 21% year on year, and there were several developer defaults. And, meanwhile, homeowners were outraged, and angry buyers who had prepaid for their homes threatened to stop paying their mortgages on homes that didn't even exist or weren't even being built yet, driving many to start boycotting. And local government from land sales also plummeted. So moving on to our next topic, which is electric cars. Jeremy?
And that in some ways is one of the bright spots for China this year. In June, CATL or CATL, the world's largest battery manufacturer, launched its third generation battery called Qilin for electric vehicles. It'll be mass produced next year, and it promises to give cars a range of at least 621 miles is the number they're giving. The company is also pioneering other new battery technologies like sodium-ion batteries, which would reduce dependence on lithium. And together with other Chinese companies, CATL now dominates the entire supply chain from mining of lithium and other metals that are necessary for batteries to the production of the final batteries themselves. China is also home to dozens of companies that make electric vehicles, including startups, established traditional auto companies like Geely and Great Wall Motors and SAIC, joint ventures with foreign car brands, like GM and VW, Volkswagen, and then the one wholly foreign-owned electric car company in China, which is Tesla, about which I'm going to have a bit more to say a little later. Tesla does still control 100% of its Shanghai-based company so far. China produced about 6 million electric vehicles this year. And in the first half of the year, BYD, which is the most established electric car company and famously invested in by Warren Buffett's fund, BYD became the world's leading electric vehicle company, selling globally more than 600,000 units. And there's also been an aggressive push this year for Chinese electric car companies to enter Europe and other markets around the world. So this is an ongoing story and one we've been following quite closely. And in terms of assessing, China and its technology, it's taken a big whack on chips and semiconductors, but it's way ahead of everybody else, including the United States, on electric cars. And it's going to be pretty tough for any other country to catch up. So we have yet another question. And we're going to get to it, but let us just take one last little dip into our red paper and look at one of the other subjects in it. And Nadia, let me ask you to summarize. How was the year 2022 for women in China?
So pretty much 10 steps backward and 1 step forward for women's rights, wasn't it? So I'm sure, I don't know, for the people who keep up with China news here, I'm pretty sure many of you saw the grim footage that came out in January of a Chinese mother who was the mother of 8 children. And she was shackled by her neck in a freezing shed in Xuzhou that drew outrage across the country. It sparked a national conversation about human trafficking and forced marriage. And then later in the summer, a group of men were caught on camera assaulting a woman and her female friends at a barbecue restaurant in Tangshan. And these and other instances of abuse against women focused public attention on women's rights, even though, Beijing's ongoing crackdown on feminist activism. There was also a mixed bag, though, in some of the country's most high-profile Me Too cases. In September, a Chinese court rejected a lawsuit filed by Zhou Xiaoxuan, whose sexual harassment allegations against a famous television host had attracted national attention since 2018, so 4 years ago. Outside China, a former University of Minnesota student accused the Chinese tech billionaire Richard Liu of rape, but she later reached an undisclosed settlement with him in the US. There was, a few bright spots, though, despite all of that doom and gloom, that towards the end of the year, when Chinese-Canadian pop star Chris Wu was sentenced to 13 years in jail for rape and other sex crimes. Meanwhile, China's top legislative body updated its decades-old law on women's rights, adding new provisions to better safeguard the protections of women in the workplace and society as a whole. But in terms of women's representation in politics, well, unfortunately, at the 20th Party Congress, no women were elected for top seats in the high echelons of the Chinese Communist Party. And this is the first time it's happened, I think, in 25 years.
The Politburo, that is, yeah. Yeah, so it's been a mixed bag. So let's get on to some of the other questions. R Sue asks, is there still an internal dissent within the CCP beyond the standing committee level? This is one of those questions that everybody has to guess, because the Communist Party is a black box, highly secretive and very intentional about keeping it that way. It's very difficult to know, and generally those who know don't talk and those who talk don't know. So take whatever I'm about to say with a pinch of salt. My feeling is that there's a lot of grumbling, both amongst the sort of red aristocrats, the second and third and fourth generation red aristocrats, and amongst the rank and file of the Communist Party. And increasingly this year, mainly because of the COVID lockdowns, amongst ordinary people. But I don't believe that any of that grumbling is even approaching a level where it presents a danger to Xi Jinping. So that would be my take. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Nadia.
No, I mean, like you said, it's pretty much all speculation, and it's difficult really to say anything concrete when you're not on the inside. So don't want to lead people astray.
Fair enough. Next question from Natasha Lark, who's a PhD student at King's College in London. Hello, London. What has been the role of an enemy in China throughout the year? Who have the CCP selected as their enemy? A country, an idea, a virus? And what measures have they used to counter it? That's an interesting question.
Anti-China forces is the first that comes to mind, which, is just seems to constantly crop up again and again in Chinese state media, especially. In fact, it was just used. In October, there was the Chinese, there was the clash at the Chinese consulate in Manchester, in which now today, actually, the Chinese Foreign Ministry came out blaming anti-China forces were at stake here. Jeremy, what do you think?
Yeah, definitely. That's a big one. And in fact, we at the China Project were accused of being hostile anti-China foreign forces earlier in the year by a blogger whose stuff then was republished by the Cyberspace Administration of China, and then followed up by various articles in the state media. And the cause of this was because we'd written about people online, Chinese men online, saying that they would be able to get beautiful Ukrainian brides, when the war broke out, when Russia invaded Ukraine. And even though our story, in fact, pointed out that a lot of Chinese people, and apparently, many more than the ones who were making these offensive comments, attacked the people saying these things, we came under fire for writing about this, and it went on for several months. There were there were blog posts and official state media articles calling us hostile forces. As some of you know, we were later accused of playing for the other side in America. So that's I guess occupational hazard. Aside from hostile foreign forces, I think the coronavirus certainly has been seen as an enemy. And in fact, particularly in the first year of the pandemic, but it's gone on until quite recently, it's been fairly explicitly framed as a war against the disease, a lot of military metaphors. What else? Enemies. Separatists are always, sort of public enemy number one in China. So in this year, that's primarily been Taiwanese separatists, as they call them. But of course, anytime there's a discussion about Uyghurs, Xinjiang or Tibet, the Chinese government talks about hostile forces of separatism that are against China. So yeah, I think those are the main ones: hostile foreign forces instigating protests about COVID lockdowns, the virus itself, and separatists. The next question: information out there which suggests Beijing has already hit the peak of the latest outbreak without large death rates. Do you agree with this analysis? Do we think this is reflective of China as a whole, mild symptoms, down to some degree efficacy of Chinese-made vaccines? Pete, I don't know, Nadia, jump in if you want, but I'm not an epidemiologist or a scientist, so I would hesitate to comment. But with that disclaimer, I can't help wondering if some of the more gloomy predictions of mass mortality, and we've published, some discussion of these, I can't help feeling that they might be a bit overwrought for a few reasons. One is that Omicron does seem to be milder. Two is at least some of the population has been vaccinated, as you mentioned. And the Chinese vaccines, I think it's pretty clear they are effective. They're not as effective as the Pfizer and Moderna shots, but they are, they do still provide protection.
Right.
I think there are another few factors. People don't mind wearing face masks in China. And as you can see, if you're either in China, in Beijing or Shanghai, or you've seen photos, people are actually self-isolating right now in fear of catching the disease. So, and then the final factor is, even though China doesn't have nearly enough hospitals or ICU wards in the event of a massive outbreak, at the very least, the medical system does understand this disease a lot better than it did 2 years ago. And Chinese doctors and the healthcare system have the benefit of the whole world's experience in dealing with it.
Oh, sorry, Jeremy.
No, go ahead.
And I'll jump in and say, likewise, I'm not an epidemiologist, but China also recently stopped counting asymptomatic cases in terms of their COVID count. So really, the information, their data collection too, I would say it would be very difficult to really find reliable information on whether or not China has hit its peak. So that's all I wanted to chime in there.
Right, we won't really know. But I see Joan Kaufman has asked a similar, do we agree with the dire predictions of many COVID deaths? I mean, I with the disclaimer again that I'm no scientist, I will come out and say that I think the direst predictions are going to be excessively pessimistic. I don't think it's going to hit China as hard as, I don't think there are going to be millions and millions of people dying. And this is on the record, so you will be able to tell me I was completely wrong if I do turn out to be wrong, but I hope I'm not wrong. So, anonymous attendee asks, if the COVID-0 policy was closely aligned with Xi Jinping, what are the consequences of the immediate policy shift after a few days of public protest? Does this undermine his authority? Nadia, what's your take?
Well, state media has been really doing their runaround in terms of making the lifting of most of their COVID-0 policies fit the narrative that I forget what the actual phrasing of it was, but basically that China will find itself on the right side of history in terms of its COVID-0 policy. So they're already trying to do some damage control there. I don't know, Jeremy, what do you think?
I think the grumbling about Xi has been made worse by this, and there's more grumbling. But I mean, if you think back to the early days of the pandemic, before it had hit the rest of the world, people were saying, oh, this is the end of Xi Jinping's authority. What have they done? What have they done? Within months, they turned it around. And many Chinese people were proudly pointing out how well China was dealing with the virus compared to everywhere else. And you've seen similar things play out in the past. I mean, the 2011, for some ancient history, the 2011 Wenzhou high-speed train crash, there was a similar, I mean, even the People's Daily at that time said, we can't afford to have a blood-soaked GDP and we're developing too fast and what are the problems with our model? That was all forgotten, within months. The Communist Party is highly resilient. And very good at molding public opinion. So I do think that Xi Jinping's reputation has taken a knock. I think it's taken a really bad knock internationally. But I don't think the damage is irreparable for him back at home in China. So one last question, and then we'll get on to the predictions if no more come in. What's the outlook for Chinese tech companies such as Tencent, Alibaba, ByteDance, both domestically and internationally? Nadia, take a stab at that, and then I'll give my opinions.
Let me think on it as well. Outlook for tech companies.
I have an answer ready to go. I think ByteDance, this could be the year, next year could be the year when TikTok has some serious problems in the United States, which will be a blow to ByteDance. I think that internationally, the Chinese tech companies are going to expand in Southeast Asia very aggressively and in Latin America. And tech companies that are below the radar, such as the mobile phone manufacturer Transsion, are already huge in Africa and only going to get bigger. I think Chinese tech companies are going to have a pretty tough time in North America and Europe, with the exception so far of Shein, the fast fashion app that is, one of the favorite, most popular shopping destinations for American teenage girls. And Shein has just been joined by a rival called Temu. I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce it. It's not, I guess it's not Temu Chinese, but Temu, I don't know, T-E-M-U. It's made by Pinduoduo, and it's basically a clone of Shein. And they've started something of a price war with Shein. These companies might get into trouble too. There's a lot of growing noise about forced labor or other labor issues that go into making the clothes so cheap. And of course, there's always the possibility that some US senator decides that this is a national security threat. So one could see that they would have trouble. But my sense is that the companies selling clothes and junk like Shein are probably going to do pretty well in the US and in Europe, whereas other companies are going to have a tougher time. It'll be really interesting to see what happens with TikTok. And this obviously is much more to do with the United States domestic situation than it is with anything ByteDance itself is doing. Anything to add to that, Nadia?
Right. I'll just speak on the international outlook in terms of Chinese tech companies. I mean, you see a pattern, especially among sort of Western nations, where a lot of governments are becoming very conscious about national security threats. And with, current geopolitical tensions, I think a lot of them are cracking down on Chinese tech companies, which a lot of them have ties to the state. And they just are very cautious about leaking their citizens' personal data. And it's not looking too bright. I mean, I think the US Senate today or yesterday unanimously passed a bill to ban TikTok, which is owned by ByteDance, in fear over national security fears. So, yeah.
Okay, we actually do have some more questions. So let's get to those before we get to the predictions. Do you foresee an opening of borders that leads to a boost in Chinese tourism to destinations around the world, and vice versa? Will there be a return in Laowai coming back to China? And personally, I hope, Laurent says, the increase in people-to-people exchanges can lead to some warming in relations. What do you think, Nadia? Increase, yes or no? More Chinese tourism outside of China?
I mean, I would hope so. I don't know whether people or not will move in the immediate future, or not move, but visit in the immediate future. But I do believe in, people-to-people ties is really where a lot of minds are changed. So I can just say that I'm hopeful that they will.
I think it's pretty certain that there are going to be a lot more Chinese tourists around the world next year than there have been for the past 3 years. I think there's a lot of pent-up demand. And as much as China's domestic travel industry has in some ways benefited from being closed, and hotels, especially on the high end, have up their service levels and this kind of thing to cater for the travelers that weren't able to go overseas, I think those people, as soon as they can, will still want to travel overseas. I mean, Chinese people are the same as people all over the place. Most people like going to foreign countries. It's fun. So I don't see why that won't happen. The only thing that might be a drain on it, I mean, I have a few fairly credible reports from people in China that the government is getting much more troublesome about issuing passports. Now, maybe this is something that will just end with, the pandemic, but one doesn't know. The Chinese Communist Party's first instinct is often to lock the door rather than open it. So, but yeah, if I had to predict, I'd say, yeah, Chinese tourists you'll see them all over the place. Will foreigners go back to China? I mean, I know this amongst many of the people that I talk to, China watchers and scholars and business people, there's a pent-up demand on that side for going back to China. But that's a fairly small number of people. I think China's global reputation is at quite a low level right now. So I think people who are already engaged with China will go back. What I don't see happening in the immediate future is a return to, the situation you had even 5 years ago, where young people, students were eager, foreign students were eager to go to China and study. Nadia, but I'm an old guy, maybe you can offer a perspective from people who are actually of student age.
Yeah, so in terms of people going out and about into the world, I will say I agree. I think people will always return. Most people have a natural curiosity to see places that aren't their own. However, I do think a lot of anti-China sentiment that you are seeing, especially again in Western nations, with the onset of COVID, it has made people a little more hesitant. I know some of the people that I know are reluctant to go places in groups of, say, Chinese people because they get accosted in some countries. I don't think that will deter people, but it definitely is something that has put a damper on the enthusiasm, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. Anonymous attendee asks, is it too cynical to say that ending zero COVID is a way to cull the herd of elderly Chinese who are a drain on wealth? That is quite cynical. I don't think one can ever be too cynical in analyzing what's going on in China myself. One can't help but feel that must have been a topic of discussion at some point. But on the other hand, everybody has elderly relatives. So I don't think this is a real policy decision. But I mean, China's been very clear about social engineering. I mean, the one-child policy is a great example of that. So I wouldn't, people may object to this, but I would say that you're not being totally over the top cynical. On a sort of related thing, Scott asked, Michael Pettis is who's a very well-known and respected commentator on China, finance and the economy in China. He's mapped out the various factors that China needs to deal with to escape the so-called middle income trap. And he boils it down to three possible scenarios: reducing investment, or shifting the share of wealth to household, and reducing dependence on exports. Do you think there's any intentionality on the part of the Communist Party in using the various crises to bring about the best of the outcomes Pettis talks about? I think there probably is some intentionality in that. I think that the Communist Party never lets a good crisis go to waste. So I don't think I don't think that's an unreasonable question. I don't know, again, how carefully planned it is, but if I can think of just some news that we covered yesterday about at least 40 local governments around China issuing consumption vouchers to people to incentivize them to buy cars and home appliances and then go to tourist sites and eat out and buy food. This is basically trying to give money directly to consumers. And I think this is an attempt to shift some of the wealth to households. And perhaps the pandemic has made it easier for them to do that. So I think, Scott, your question is very reasonable. I would hesitate to say how much of a factor it is in the decisions they're making right now. Wow, we're getting a lot of questions. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to take a quick break from the questions and let's just get on to our predictions, because I want to tell you about some of them and see if there's any feedback. And we'll get back to the questions if we have enough time. So our record of predictions is, as all, predictions are a fool's game, and we got plenty wrong. But in 2019, we did predict that China would experience an epizootic, epidemic, or mass food safety crisis. And of course, at the end of that year, COVID-19 emerged. In 2020, we did correctly forecast that Tsai Ing-wen would be re-elected as Taiwan's president with an overwhelming majority. For 2021, we predicted that Hong Kong media mogul Jimmy Lai and other opposition figures would receive lengthy jail sentences on charges related to their business activities and as well as national security laws, and that did indeed happen. For 2022, we did predict that Russia would invade Ukraine, and we did say that COVID-0 would end in the autumn, in the fall of this year, and maybe we were a few months early on that. You can check out, all of our predictions. We'll send them with the new red paper. We'll send links to all the old ones so you can see our track record. So Nadia, should we run through some of the ones that we're working on at the moment that we're going to finalize and publish next week?
The predictions or
The predictions.
Okay, one second.
I will start with the first one that I mentioned already. I don't think China's going to invade Taiwan in 2023. I think between the economic problems, the terrible performance of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and all the fires that Xi Jinping is going to have to put out, I think it's highly unlikely, and I'm almost 99.9999% sure that there's not going to be an invasion. So that's the answer I've been giving people who ask me.
That ties into one of the next question, when someone asked, why does everybody assume that China would invade Taiwan when it can far more easily strangle it with an effective blockade? So just to tie that into your prediction there.
I think that's a very good point. An effective blockade, hacking, there's a lot of stuff they could do. And I mean, one of the things that I ask people about, and I get very mixed answers, is Taiwan doesn't seem to really be, it doesn't have a defense mindset. It doesn't seem to be prepared for an invasion. It's not like Finland or Israel or South Korea that have, real conscription programs where all men at least have to spend a significant chunk of time in military training and then in the military. I grew up in apartheid era South Africa, and I was supposed to go to the army for 2 years. And we had this defense mindset. It was everywhere in the country, and Taiwan just doesn't seem to have that. So, China could just park a couple of huge ships around it, blockade the trade, and start hacking, and maybe Taiwan will just give up the ghost, But yeah, I think, Alan, you're right. What happened to my beard? I shaved it off. Sorry about that. It was very unpopular with most of the people in my immediate orbit. So
It ran away. It ran away for the holidays.
Alan also asked why people are focusing on the idea that China didn't, that COVID-0 was in fact totally overwhelmed by the rapid spread of the virus in major cities. They didn't prepare vaccines or large stocks of things like paracetamol. I think that's very true. And I think perhaps we've perhaps also been slightly guilty of overemphasizing the role of the protests in the end of the policy. I mean, I think the timing of protests were a significant factor, but I don't think that was the only thing. I think you're right. They simply weren't prepared for the virus to be as infectious as it turned out to be. Should we take another question, or should we go to another prediction?
Why don't we go through some? We have a whole list of predictions, so why don't we go through a few more first?
All right. So
take
electric cars. So yes. I think that the electric car businesses continue. China is going to continue to dominate it, and they have such control of the entire supply chain. It's going to be very, very difficult for any other country's companies to achieve anything like the the position China has in electric vehicles. And I think you're going to start seeing Chinese electric vehicles on the roads all over the world. Maybe not so much in the United States, but pretty much everywhere else. I think in China, I think Tesla is going to run into some real trouble. And I think there are a few reasons. One is that there are a lot of Chinese electric vehicle cars that are electric vehicle companies that are actually struggling. It's a really, really brutal marketplace. I think Elon Musk's dabbling, well, not dabbling, what do you call it? The chaos at Twitter is quite possibly is going to have some kind of blowback in China. And then there have been ongoing sort of attacks on Tesla through certain state organizations, accusations that, you know, the cars are like spying on people in China. There was some rules that you can't drive a Tesla into a military compound. And, you know, I could see that something could happen that makes it very, very uncomfortable for Tesla in China in the next year. Political stability. I don't think, you know, all these questions about Xi Jinping, I don't think this is the year that Xi is going to lose power. But I would be prepared for some kind of luan, some kind of chaos. I think what Lynette Ong, a scholar who wrote for the China Project recently, she called the seeds of dissent have been sown. And I think there is a new awareness in China of the fact that, you know, sometimes going on the streets can actually get results. Whether that was true or not, I think people are feeling that. I think there's a lot of grumbling. 20% of the youth are unemployed, and that's never good for a country's stability. I think the other thing we'll see this year is declining birth rate. It declined in 2022, and I think it's going to go down even further, because I don't think this has been a good year for people to make babies, and I don't think the first half of next year will encourage people to reproduce either. Immigration. I don't know, Nadia, I'm going to ask you what your sense of this is, but my sense is that the queues for green cards and visas, immigrant visas to other countries are going to grow this year. There's this 润学, famously, you know, how to run away from China, that began in the Shanghai lockdown. What's your sense of that?
I think so as well. You know, COVID fatigue was very real. And I think there was also a lot of, I think COVID zero really did shake a lot of people's trust in the Communist Party, to a point where, you know, if there was going to be emigrations, it would definitely be once all of these COVID zero restrictions have been lifted. That's just my take.
Okay. Let's go back to some questions. So anonymous attendee asks that yesterday the House GOP made claims that COVID may be linked to Chinese bioweapons programs and gave new credence to the idea that it was accidentally leaked from the Wuhan lab doing gain-of-function research. Given this new information, does it impact your view of the zero-COVID policy and what may be to come? You know, again, I'm no scientist, but I mean, every single year I lived in China, I had like a bad flu or respiratory disease of some kind. You know, I was there for SARS. I don't think China's, you know, even now, there's plenty of markets where you have animals coming in from the countryside, sometimes wild animals right next to domesticated animals. You have some of the most densely populated cities on the planet, where, you know, subway cars are absolutely packed full of people breathing on each other. To me, like Occam's razor, I find that the idea of the lab leak, I mean, I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it seems to me like the least plausible explanation, personally. I also think one should be very careful about the arguments you're hearing sometimes in DC about this lab leak theory, because they are very clearly politically motivated. And while there are some scientists who are talking about it, and I don't think that investigating gain of function research should be, off the table. This seems to me like a political campaign, not a scientific inquiry. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about Chinese companies that want to do overseas business in 2023? That's an interesting question. I think it depends where and what they're doing. I think that the United States and Western Europe are going to be increasingly tougher, particularly the United States, particularly for certain kinds of companies. But we can't cut ourselves off in the United States, and no one in the rest of the world can cut themselves off from the Chinese export machine. The supply chains just aren't there. And Chinese businesses are becoming extremely competitive. The electric cars made in China are world-class electric cars. And that's going to count for a lot. So I would say I'd be broadly optimistic for Chinese companies doing overseas business, with some very notable exceptions. So I'm not going to ask the question, the prediction side, will I grow the beard back? I don't think so, Joan. I think the people in my immediate orbit, like my wife, it would not be good for me. So I can actually be pretty certain about that answer. On a more serious note, will there be increased military capability transfer from Russia to China in exchange for tacit support of the war in Ukraine? That is a very interesting question. China's military industrial complex, if you can call it that, is increasingly, high tech. There's a lot of effort being put into self-developing Chinese jet engines. I can't really see how much more Russia can give to China. I mean, they don't have enough actual weapons themselves now. They need apparently weapons from North Korea and Iran. So I don't think it's going to be weapons sales. China is still quite dependent on Russian fighter jet technology. China has its own ballistic missile program that is very advanced. And in fact, the US fears Chinese develop like hypersonic weapons. So I don't really see that China has more to gain in that. And I think the tacit support of the war in Ukraine is kind of baked in right now. I don't see that really changing. Now, what are the top black swans on the horizon? I'm going to land you with that horrible question, Nadia.
The top black swans. Oh, sorry, 1 second. My computer is acting up a bit. Apologies.
It's that bad internet in London after they kicked Huawei out.
It is, and it's the snow, I swear. We just got some snow here a couple days ago and everything's been on the fritz. Sorry, Jeremy, would you mind? Sorry.
I will take the question. The top black swans, that's kind of an impossible question because, the whole thing about a black swan, I guess, is that it's completely unpredictable. If I had to say a black swan event, I would say that there's a coup. Xi Jinping is deposed, and that's not something I think is going to happen. So I can't really see what else, and that may be the problem with my own imagination. Let's go on to another couple of predictions then. Actually, let's take this question. Following up on the comment on overseas companies, are you optimistic about Chinese electric vehicle companies to continue to expand to Western countries? Would the US block them like Huawei? I think the US would love to block Chinese electric car companies, and they may well make it difficult for them to sell the cars in the United States. But I think the US is pretty stuck with batteries. There's no other country at the moment that can produce the batteries that the world needs. So I don't think that's going to stop in any way. But I mean, as soon as you see any numbers of Chinese-made electric cars on the roads in the US, if that indeed happens, you're going to also have a real political backlash, and you're going to see the same kinds of fears about surveillance from the electric cars that you have in China right now about Teslas. Ralph asks, will subnational contacts between China and the US, sister city or provincial delegations, academic conferences, hands across the water groups increase in 2023? We're seeing some signs of that already. Yeah, I think they will. I mean, there has been, for all the gloom, there has been something of a warming of ties. There's been, a lot more meetings. Xi Jinping met Joe Biden at the G20 in Bali. So even from very top level, you've seen somewhat of a thaw. And I think there are a lot of people on both sides of the Pacific that want to continue these kind of people-to-people exchanges, but it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to go back to the way it was. I know that say in Tennessee, where I live, there's been some scrutiny from the FBI on local organizations that are engaged in this kind of activity, and I think that kind of that atmosphere is going to scare some people off, not everybody, and I think it can hardly be worse than the last 3 years. So even just with the opening up of borders, you're going to see more of it, but I would not forecast like a huge change from what we've seen. It just doesn't seem likely to me. And I think we had one more question that we could take, which we just about ended, from Alan again, about the rapid explosion of the virus in Beijing indicates that the situation was already out of control by the time they abandoned the policy. Yeah, we discussed that already. Is there any indication of whether there's political intrigue for power behind these policy shifts? Again, there's such a black box that all we can do is guess about this. My own instinct is that the level, as I said before, of grumbling has increased a great deal. But it would be a very brave person within China's political system who would actually start plotting against Xi Jinping. Brave to the point of being crazy, given his overwhelming control of the security services and the military. And let's end on a gloomy note. Not a prediction, but a possibility from Ed Sand of China Talk, who's somebody who knows a lot about China. Outbreaks in China could lead to new COVID variants that are worse than Omicron and plunge us all back into chaos. Yeah, I guess so. Would you like to offer your informed opinion on that, Nadia?
Yes, as a seasoned doctor, but don't come kidding. Well, at least if something like that does happen, China now has a lot of infrastructure and has been building out its infrastructure, that if something were to occur, then perhaps they could do something similar to a COVID-0 lockdown once again. Whether or not they will is, all up for speculation, but, the infrastructure is there.
Yeah, no, it is indeed. I think that is, a lot of people have made a big fuss about the fact that the travel app that the national health code, green code app that has been used to monitor COVID infections, that's been just completely stopped, and that this is an indication that fears that China would continue to use this technology, even after the pandemic, were overwrought. And perhaps it's true that they're not going to continue using that particular app to monitor population, and that it's not some big, bad, scary, totalitarian thing. Nonetheless, they have the app and they could start using it again. So I think you're right. There is a bunch of infrastructure in place if the outbreak gets worse again. And on that gloomy note, we have reached the end of our hour. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope it was worth your while. We had fun. We are going to publish our red paper next week, and all of you being subscribers will get an email about it and be able to look at it on our website. If you have any thoughts about next year, any predictions that you think we should consider including, please email them to me, jeremy@thechinaproject.com, or you can just use our editorial email address, editors@thechinaproject.com, which goes to all of our editors. Thank you all very much for joining. Thanks, Nadia, for keeping me company. And we will see you again soon at our next members-only event. Thanks again for your support. And for those who may not read every word I write and will not get a Christmas or New Year or Hanukkah greeting before the end of the year, let me take the opportunity now to wish you a very merry festive season and all the best for 2023.